Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. I am once again joined by my roundtable host crew, Keith, Alec, and Florian. Glad to be back, everybody. So today is our 107th episode, The History of American Education. This was an idea that was recommended to me by Alec. One of the things that we often do is we'll often, after streams or between streams, float ideas to get to find that we're all on the same page and are interested in what we're talking about. And I thought Alec brought up a really interesting idea about the history of American education. It's something we all interested in here on the roundtable. So yeah, Alec, why don't you introduce us to this?
Well, the first thing to know about the history of American education is that it was brought to the U.S. from Prussia by Senator Horace Mann, who was a big admirer of Otto and Bismarck and the German way of managing state assets and turning the citizenry into the wards of the state. That came in very handy in the late 19th century in the United States, as we were in the middle of at the apogee of the Industrial Revolution. This was the time for factories to be growing, and this was the time when the robber barons needed docile workers. And what better way is there to create docile workers than to model them on the system for creating obedient soldiers in Prussia? So the fundamental idea of Horace Mann's interpretation of Prussian education is that the student must be obedient, must be docile, must be punctual, must be polite, must pretty much be not so different from a good dog. And that was great for the factory economy. And we can see many similarities between the factory and the public school. Lines, people line up to do things. There is a bell. Between intervals, between breaks between classes, there is a task manager who's like a teacher. And then, of course, you do what is required, not more, not less. The teacher gives you a rubric, gives you a worksheet, and you must produce the product exactly the way the teacher wants it, just as you might in a factory. The table has to be 50, it has to have legs that are 50 centimeters long, not 51. It must be 25 centimeters wide, not 26. The idea is following instructions to the T. Now, as the owner of academic composition, I've noticed this quite a bit. I've been in this business since 2009. And one thing I understood immediately is that the best way to do well is to follow the instructions. Act like you are a factory worker. Act as if you're creating a product that must hit specific instructions. And in fact, what I find interesting that even today, among the best students in the United States are Asians, or Asian Americans. And I wonder why is that? Well, Asian cultures, especially the low-income Asian countries, that have a culture of obedience that is instilled by Confucian values. And in fact, now they're excelling as factory workers. Where do we get our phones manufactured? Where do we get our gadgets from? Well, China, Taiwan, perhaps, other lower income countries such as Indonesia. And again, these groups seem to be following the same model that Horace Mann tried to introduce in the United States. He tried to import that to the U.S. And that did not go as well. That did not go as well as Horace Mann was hoping it would. Essentially, America, after all, has a culture of individualism that a lot of people did drop out of school, still do. And even at that time, it was difficult to instill the kind of obedience that Asian employers would take for granted. And that is when Senator Mann decided to double down on his efforts to really try to integrate German values into the United States. And in fact, toward the end of the 19th century, the United States had more German migrants than it did immigrants from people from the English-speaking countries. That reinforced the Prussian system of education. Fortunately, just several decades later, Horace Mann had a lucky break, or rather, fortunately for him, unfortunately for America. America has transitioned from being a factory society, factory-driven economy, a manufacturing society, to being a corporate society. And that happened toward the middle of the 20th century. right in the aftermath of World War II, it became apparent that America was then in a position to slowly but surely begin modernizing its economy as we see it today. We no longer were a society where most people worked in the factory. There was a broader variety of industries available for different levels of intellectual ability. And that's where George Ritzer's model of mcdonaldization comes in. George Ritzer is a famous sociologist who wrote an essay on the mcdonaldization of society, that essentially every American industry should operate the way a fast food joint would operate. It must be efficient, calculable, predictable, and highly controlled. And the idea is that, again, going back to Horace Mann's example with the factory, that the table's got to be a certain number of centimeters high, certain number of centimeters wide. And in McDonald's, the burger must have only this much mayonnaise, only one pickle, not two, so on and so on. This reinforces the pattern of rigid adherence to guidelines. Now, anybody who has experience working in academia extensively, either as a professor, as a TA, or as a student even, well, we'll tell you that the key to doing well in any assignment is simply following the instructions. So there is a synthesis of the Prussian ideas that Horace Mann introduced to America and George Ritzer's mcdonaldization. In fact, as a student myself back in the mid 2000s, I remember I had some experience working in fast food joints. And when I was 17, I recall that I had to take a chemistry class where I did not do well because I did not want to memorize the table of elements. I did not want to follow the simple instructions for how to cook something in a chemistry lab, so I failed the class. Later that same year, I ended up getting a job at Taco Bell, and I've come face to face with the same McDonaldized way of doing business. Before I'd get a job there, I'd be forced to memorize all the key ingredients that go into making tacos at Taco Bell or quesadillas. And then I'd be given simple instructions to follow, how to create the food. Now, this, of course, is fundamentally different from the experience what one may undergo in a culinary school, especially in the European society. For instance, if you want to learn how to make Italian pasta, the approach will be different. You have to become an artist in your own right. You would have to understand about the concepts of different kinds of flavors, the palates, and then in the human mouth, the tastes people have, how the Italian culture has evolved, and how Italian cuisine supplements the Italian culture. Of course, this is an abstract, big picture way of learning how to cook. And if you are to learn Japanese cuisine, again, you have to become an artist in your own right, and similarly to how you might study music or fine arts or painting. That's in fact how you would study in a serious university where they take critical thinking and liberal education seriously. Where you would have to understand texts, complex ideas, the dynamics of theoretical frameworks, and so on. But no, in my chemistry class and in Taco Bell and all the other fast food joints, none of that mattered. Nobody at McDonald's, Taco Bell, or Jimmy John's, or Arby's, or wherever ever bothered to offer even the most basic education as to what on earth ketchup is, why one seasoning is better than the other. What about the history of burgers? What about it all? Nobody cares. And in fact, my time living in Spain made me realize why that is. So as I walk the streets of Malaga, I've noticed that the only business that was open constantly was Starbucks and, of course, McDonald's. And there, what you see is what you get. You know exactly how many inches how many inches high, how many inches wide your burger is. You know exactly how many seconds it will take for you to get served. And you know exactly what quality you'll get, even if it's not so great. On the other hand, if I were to go to a local Spanish place where I order a paella or order a tapa, well, it really depends. Everybody has their own spin. Every Spanish chef thinks that he's a creative artist, that he will gladly tell you that his restaurant was owned by his family for 10 generations. And then there is a unique sauce they produce that they've created in that same facility. And you never know what you're going to get there. It varies from place to place. You never know when they're going to close and when they're going to open. Sometimes the hours they post are for decoration only. They close whenever they want, and even they chased me out of the place in the middle of the afternoon because they wanted to close for a siesta. Yet to an American mind, this would be utterly unthinkable, inconceivable from start to finish. And then you've got to ask, though, as an American, you got to wonder, why on earth would you go to a Spanish tapa bar where service is unpredictable, quality varies from day to day, timely delivery leaves for a lot to be desired, efficiency is just not there. Why don't you just go to McDonald's or Starbucks or Burger King? And if you ask a local Spanish person about this, he will just tell you plainly and simply that you are an idiot. You do not understand it. You need to get de-Americanized, that you're used to having everything so McDonaldized, so cut and dry that you may as well be dealing with robots. But you see, if you go into a Spanish establishment, you will have to accept all the human flaws that go into it. That the Spanish chef is not the most reliable person. Maybe not the waiter, who's usually just a family member, is not the most consumer friendly. But if you go there, you appreciate the art. You appreciate that there is creative expression going on in the way he produces his food. And there is also an expression of his individuality in the way he runs his restaurant, how he decorates it, and how he treats some customers well, but others not so much. See, to an American corporate mind, this is a no-no, and since from cradle, where we are indoctrinated to act like McDonald's employees, regardless of what we do. There is no place for creative expression. There is no place for individuality. But what if you are a rugged individualist, as many Southern Americans fashion themselves, that you love being a small business owner? Well, don't you get to run your small business the way that you want? Well, that's not how you're educated. Yes, the idea is that you need to get big. You need to be Donald Trump. You need to be the boss of a transnational corporation. You don't want to stay small. In fact, Jordan Peterson shared an anecdote of this sort, that when he was a young man, he admired several business owners who were his mentors, and he once brought up a comment about social marketing.
No, hold on, Alex, you're breaking up. Hold on.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. So start over again from Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, so Jordan Peterson was saying that when he was a young man, that he thought that the socialists gave a very nice, generous deal to small business owners. And he asked one of his mentors, who was also a small business owner, why didn't he vote for socialists? And you know what the mentor said? Small business owners do not want to stay small. They want to be corporate overlords, and that's how we're educated in North America. And that's the point. That if you are in Spain and you think you're a creative artist of tapas or whatever, of paellas or whatever it is that your business is in, you don't want to be a McDonald's. You don't care if you don't become a CEO of a large corporation. It doesn't matter to you. That you want your privacy, you want your independence, you want to open your doors and you want to close them whenever you want. And if a customer is not happy with you, well, that's so much for the worse for them. And then you'll just find customers who appreciate your art, and then and that's going to be that. Now in America, again, we have a very McDonaldized system of education that's grounded in Horace Mann's Prussian system of education. And what are we supposed to do about this? Well, John Dewey introduced the notion that in order to have a robust democracy, we must have a system of education that promotes critical thinking, and in the sense that we need to be a little bit more like a Spanish chef rather than a fry cook at McDonald's. That we need to have our own well-informed opinions of how things work. And Dewey believed that to make this happen, what we need essentially is a system that fosters independent thought and experiential learning. That where we learn by doing, that we don't follow cookbook recipes as I did in a chemistry class or at McDonald's. Instead, You're going to learn through trial and error. You are going to have to understand big picture ideas. And that's how Dewey thought education should work. Now, John Taylor Gatto, an American former teacher, was a similar idea, though he was a little bit more to the left of Dewey. He was more radical. John Taylor Gatto argued that we should experiment with homeschooling. We should experiment with all sorts of unstructured approaches. And essentially every parent would find a best way to educate their own child. Now that's a little extreme. I'm more static.
You're breaking up again, Alex. Hold on. Did we lose him?
What was the last thing you heard me say?
Parents choosing how to educate their own children.
Yes, so every parent should be able to choose their own way to educate their own children. That was the experiment in radically different ways to. God damn it! Hello,
Okay.
am I up constantly? Hello.
Okay, maybe try turning off your camera. Sometimes you can hear better without a camera. Or your okay.
How about now?
Yeah, it's better. Yep.
Yeah. So John Taylor Gatto was all for unstructured forms of education that as independent and as radical as it can possibly be. Is still better than a McDonaldized system. Now, there's just one counterpoint to Gatto. But Barrington Moore famously said that if there is no bourgeois, if there is no middle class, there will be no democracy. So a proponent of the McDonaldized education system would say, well, the best way to create a middle class is to let corporations do whatever they want. So let's just create docile chattel for corporations to exploit. But we've seen right through this. As Joel Kotkin in The Common and Neo-Feudalism explained, the corporations nowadays are creating a neo-feudal society that we're becoming a two-tier economy. And the only way to really deal with this is to foster entrepreneurship. It's to foster independent thought and education, empower people to challenge the corporate dictates, and create a truly competitive market environment. We have already had a growth spurt in the economy, where corporations have had their say, they've made their contribution. Now we're getting to a point where pretty much all labor power that exists serves the purpose of empowering the corporate elites, rather than that of helping the average American contribute to the economy. So I reject the argument that a McDonaldized system of education is necessary for the middle class to flourish. If anything, evidence shows that economic freedom, and that means true capitalism, true market competition, not crony capitalism, is what creates economic growth and sustains it. That is what fosters the middle class. And if we have that, if we have an educated citizenry, the way that many Northern European countries do, our scores in the democracy index will improve. At this point, America is an anocracy, neither democracy nor an autocracy, and it keeps on sliding backwards. And the culprit here is the deplorable state of the system of education, which badly needs rectification.
Okay, Keith. Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, I could approach the topic of education from a number of different angles. I don't think there's ever been any such thing as non-ideological education. The norm with education in the pre-modern world, like in antiquity or in the Middle Ages, was that education was largely reserved for elites because it was thought that, well, peasants and serfs and slaves and all of these other peoples don't really need education, or it could even be dangerous to educate those people. But even for elites, education was not value neutral. Typically, you were educated to be a good Greek citizen or a good Roman citizen, or a good member of the aristocracy, or a member of the Catholic Church, depending on the time period. And what happened with that is in modernity, when the modern ideas of republicanism and democracy and things like that started to expand, And parallel to that, you had the rise of the public administration state idea. You have the emergence of the Westphalian state in the 17th century, and then in the 19th century, you start to see the rise of the public administration state as an extension of that. And along with that came this emphasis on public education. If you go back and look in when public school systems were founded, it was founded during the same time that these public administration states were starting to develop. But it was never the case that education was considered a value unto itself, that people should just have knowledge to have knowledge. Public schools were created for some of the reasons Aleksey described, and that was to inculcate subjects with the values of the state. As mass society started to grow, there's this idea of, well, we need to inculcate whatever civic norms or state ideology there is into those who are subjects. And that could assume a lot of different forms. On one hand, some of the communist regimes of the 20th century were really big on education. They emphasized high literacy rates and things like that. But they did so in a framework that was really big on inculcating the communist ideology as a civic or political value. I used to have a friend of mine who graduated from high school in 1960. And as a senior in high school, they were required to take a loyalty oath, meaning they're not going to, try to overthrow the government and promote communism or something. And he was one of the leaders of a student movement to end loyalty oaths in the New York City public school system, which they did successfully. This wasn't in some backwoods, Texas county. This was in New York City in the 1960s. So nowadays, the common civic values that are used to inculcate, that the public educational system and the university system are used to inculcate, are the progressive, politically correct, woke, whatever you want to call it nowadays. And it's interesting because over the years I've had discussions with people on the progressive side of the political spectrum about education. And one opinion that I have that they tend to be most offended by is the idea that compulsory education laws should be repealed, and that education should simply be as diverse as possible. Like there's no constituency for eliminating the public school system like hardcore libertarians, anarcho-capitalists, and all that want to do. But I'm of the viewpoint that education should simply be as diverse as possible. There should be as many different models of education, as many different value systems being promoted as possible. There can be private school, home school, public school, parochial school, religious schools, secular schools, unschooled, free school, some of these more experimental things that some people come up with. I was always interested somewhat in the alternative educational models that were developed by people like Francisco Ferrer and A.S. Neal, Ivan Illich, Paul Goodman, people like that, in the 20th century. It's never been anything that was been a major focus of mine or something I'm particularly doctrinaire about. But I don't think that there's ever really been an educational system that's not about ideological inculcation of some type, except for perhaps experimental schools that really do have a high level of independence, where you weren't really, there wasn't really some set of civic values being inculcated. I taught in one like that briefly over 30 years, probably about 35 years ago. It was a high school that was affiliated with the public school system, but it was also somewhat experimental. A lot of kind of problem kids went there. And it was very similar to the Deweyite model of education. I taught a political science class there. So I've noticed also from being around different types of education, like my own K through, most of my elementary school and middle school was in. I went to a private Christian school run by an independent Baptist church. Then I went to a local public school system in a rural county in Virginia for a couple of years. And as far as anything beyond that, I was in a community college at one point, and I was in a public university. Most of my degrees are from a public university, a state university. And then And then I've taught in, I mentioned I taught at an experimental high school, but I've mostly taught in community colleges, state universities, and some private universities. And it seems like that you have many of the same issues everywhere you go, regardless of what specific kind of educational model you have. First of all, you have the issue of one problem with making education universal, as is the norm in modern societies, is that you certainly have students of differing abilities. And what do you do about that? How do you accommodate that? Do you one impact of that is I think it tends to have the effect of dumbing down education to make it more workable for everybody who is present, because the bottom line is you just can't teach some students certain things because they just don't have the ability for it. So instead of uplifting those students, what you do is you kind of dumb it down for the other students. And as far as the mcdonaldization model, increasingly the university system works that way, where what the business model that universities operate on today, and this is true of public and private universities. This isn't a private sector versus public sector thing, is that they're businesses that want to generate as much money as possible, whether in tuition payments or donations or government funding or grants from other sources. They want to bring in as much revenue as possible. And that's a status symbol. Having a large university with state-of-the-art football fields and stuff is a status symbol. It's just like individuals that want to live in a house with a pool and a golf course in the backyard. So increasingly, what's happening in higher education is that they're loosening the admission standards to colleges and universities, to the point where now many colleges and universities essentially take anybody. That's certainly true with these online degree mills. It's increasingly true of many state universities. Community colleges always took anybody. And so the standards are being lowered to the point where now college is basically like public school. It's really just like college nowadays is another, or K through 12. I just said K through 12. College nowadays is like another 4 years of K through 12. So we have K through 16, or might as well. And so what used to be college education is not really done until you get to the graduate level nowadays in colleges and universities. And again, it's so that part of this is so they can bring in as many students and collect as much revenue as they want. And as far as the ideological content of education, I think one problem with education is that it tends to be run by extremists. Often in the college and university system, and some public schools as well, you have people running the educational system who see this as a means of inculcating students with their own ideological framework, which is often way to the left of what normal people would prefer. And then the educational systems that dissent from that have their own educational models, they often operate far to the right of what normal people would prefer. Now, that doesn't mean normal people are always right or always have the best ideas as to how things ought to be done. I'm not really big on the idea of facts by consensus, but there is a problem, I think, with education being used in this way, and this is an age-old problem. That's why I tend to be for as much diversity of education as possible, in terms of organizational models, in terms of funding sources, in terms of institutional structures, in terms of ideological content or academic subjects and that kind of stuff. I'm pretty much for as much diversity of education as possible. Just like we have, in the United States at least, we have a huge diversity of church denominations and religious communities. And I generally favor having a similar model for education.
All right, Florian.
Yeah, great points. And especially when Aleksey talked about mcdonaldization of education and how in McDonald's you have these very strict, streamlined way to make a burger, and that's heated certain amount of time, certain degree, and then one pickle and so on and so forth. And it struck me that this is actually not the main business model of McDonald's if you go down to it, because the main business, the way how McDonald's makes their money is by franchising, by real estate. Basically, they have all the, all their franchisee restaurants, I would call it. They sit on land that McDonald's owns, and McDonald's basically rents them out, franchises the model, and whoever is a franchisee will then have a very strict rule how McDonald's needs to conduct its business here, and he gets some money from that. Franchisees also get money, but they're also not really owning it, right? So they're basically subletting, basically getting a profit for themselves. But it's like a little bit like renting several buildings and subletting each one of them, right? So if you think about it, then um, if people really want to become rich, they will never become rich just by following a streamlined model of education. All the factory work that McDonald's and other companies promote, that's just like a layer on top that makes the model going, but that's not the way how somebody gets rich by working for McDonald's. And so it seems to me that it's like almost like a different dimension of people that, like, of societal elite that becomes rich is on one dimension, and then the people that work and are obedient workers, or even maybe franchisees, they are on a different stream. And those will never, and there's never any true social mobility between those two streams, right? Because they're basically on completely different levels. And so education is kind of like, if you think about it, then it seems like almost that education is a joke. It's just kept like to keep people in place and to do something that, that they're not, to justify the overall model. But it's not the way that people in society make money. I mean, the people that are really rich, societal elites. And yet you could say that, well, they still produce a value to society. But it's really funny thinking about that, because I think that's one of the major points of influx into the red pill community. That's what the red pill community calls the cathedral, right? So basically, I actually remember my one of my uncles at some family gathering, and he basically made it up to being a CEO of a hospital. He's a surgeon, and he told us that, uh, he tried all his career to get up to CEO, and then he realized that you're still just a larger cog in the system. Like, and so that the realization that people who are stuck in middle management positions, that they basically just like some cogs in the machine, that makes people to search for the red pill and similar streams, right? So basically, um, that's the cruel truth of the educational system. It's not there to make people to maximize personal benefit, but just to be a useful cog in the machine for society. For some people, that's really good. They love that. They are happy with that. But if you search more out of life, that may not be the path. That may not be the path you want to go. And if you think about it, when Horace Mann adopted the Prussian system for the United States, what the United States didn't have was the all the other institutions that Prussia also had, right? If people went to school in Prussia and they had something they had something to look forward to, right? They wanted to be good in school because then they could have a better position in the army, and they could be respected at the end of their careers. In Germany, you still have people that are proud bureaucrats, right? They have some title of ministerial director, and that really means something to them. So they really, I was at the opera with my father the other day, and some of his friends came along, or like guy he knew, and he was like proudly telling us how he has worked for the some bureaucratic system was in Hamburg, I think some state function, and he has been in that system for 20-30 years, and he is so proud of what he is, and he valued German art and everything. But he was very much like on this streamlined way, and you almost feel a little sorry for him, but he liked it, right? So it was good for him. But that's a remnant from the Prussian system. People had something to look forward to. I'm not sure whether that really worked in the US, and we talked already about that. Alex had talked about that mainly. That U.S. is a very individualistic country. It doesn't have all the other institutions that Prussia also had, right? So what then tends to happen is then probably McDonaldization was the next best step that could happen to an institutionalized education system, right? I do have to say that there's one area where institutionalized education system, like a Prussian education system, can work, and that was kind of an experiment that some schools in California did in the 1950s and 1960s. It was pioneered by the La Sierra High School, and that high school was in California, and they had a physical education program where people had to get a certain they had to do a certain number of pull-ups, had to run under a certain amount of time, and had to swim a certain amount of miles. And then when you had passed that first step, you got a red trouser, then you could wear a blue short, and then you could wear a blue short with some golden stripes or something like that. And that was a popular program, and that was very much like very much taught in the Prussian style system, and it's like almost military drills. And that was one of the reasons why the program also failed, because more and more kids in the 1960s didn't feel like they want to be the best in class just to be shipped off to Vietnam as front of the line, right? So that whole program was shelved. But I thought about, like, maybe that is one aspect of education that can help, and maybe that can be part of the diversity of education that Keith talked about. Maybe the Prussian style education system isn't bad for some aspects. Like if you have a way to get like almost compulsory physical education to kids, what most people that go through such a program say that gave them mental clarity. If you're able to exert yourself physically in a way that an average person cannot do, like an average person nowadays, you get also clarity of mind, and that will actually, maybe ironically, be something that will help you become more independent of a system, right? There's this joke that you have the A students work for the C students because they are such obedient and rule following workers. Now, the C students are more like the street smart students, right? But they are also not believing in the system as much because they're not faring very well in it. So, but if you have some compulsory physical education, or if you have some way of strengthening your body, then, and that also clears your mind, you will have an easier time also being an independent thinker. So maybe that could be an interesting place for the Prussian style education in like an overall diverse school system. And then there's also a way that society also feeds back on the type of education that you get. For example, if you look at TikTok, there's people bemoan that students in the United States, the kids in the United States, they look at they look at some SJW with some red hair, and they talk about how they are LGBTQ and very ideologically drenched, whereas China shows their kids like math and science, right? But there's nothing that would prevent people here to also just like preferably look at math and science content. It's not, I don't think it's a sinister way that the Chinese government tries to streamline their children for math and science, and we don't do it. We can do it here as well. Just nobody does it. And what I and I don't know how to solve that. It comes from an overall jadedness of people with the educational system, I think, and then it's just more fun to look at some of these videos, but it's not done on a national effort where people identify with a nation or with a system where they want to be really, really, really good and really become good in math and science, want to become entrepreneur and things like that. But that is something that is, but I don't know how to implement that, because that would require some societal coherence, right? And that's not quite there. So the only way I can see out of the problem with our education system is that.
No, we lost you, Florian. Hold on. What, Florian? We lost you. I can't hear you.
I don't think he can hear us either.
Yeah. Okay. He's not looking. So for now, what we're going to do is we're going to remove him from the chat. Hopefully that gets his attention. So right now, I guess I'll put in my part, and hopefully Florian can fix his audio issues. There's a lot to say here. I think the first thing I'll say is when we look at education, historically it did two things. It was meant to create a certain kind of man, a well-rounded, well-educated, or often also called well-bred man, and then one who knew how to think, not what to think. So, as an example, there was a story that C.S. Lewis told about him visiting some cutting-edge school that was going to produce, new students. And the teacher or the headmaster led him around and showed him all these, unique, instructors and unique techniques that they were learning. And then C.S. Lewis asks him, well, this is all very interesting, but what kind of a student are you going to graduate? Like, who is this person going to be? And the headmaster had no idea how to answer. And that really just sums up the problem with modern education. It's not there to actually produce anything. Because when the kid walks out the door, or if you're university, the young adult, who is it? They don't know. Now they'll give some boilerplate answer, but really they don't know, and they're not producing a coherent, unified thing. So that's the first thing. It's there to create a certain kind of man, and then teaching you the rules of thinking. Because, well, let's go back to the first one. The idea of a liberal arts classical education, we can say goes back to the ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, and it continued well into the 20th century. That doesn't mean that we're all the same. I mean, of course, we have a common language with culture and religion and all of these things in order to have an identity and communicate with each other. So, of course, there's debates. There's Aristotle versus Plato. That's one set of debate. You've got Plato versus not the Cynics, but the Sophists. And so, right, that's not to say that we're all the same, but this is a common shared identity that we have over time as Western men. And that is encouraged and inculcated. Why? Well, because it's a precondition for political life. It's a precondition for one of the things that Aleksey was talking about, democracy. And one of the reasons why modern democracy in America is failing is because we don't have a liberal arts education anymore. After 1945, it was replaced by STEM. So we have basically an engineering-oriented education system. And that's basically a way for corporations to cut costs. It's the government that does the on-the-job training on the taxpayer's dime to get all of these engineer quality people to do the work. If the corporations had to pay for that instruction themselves, we would not have an economy the way it currently is. And this has all been at the expense of a liberal arts education. And that's sort of what Lewis is getting at with this life experience story. Now, the other thing is then how to think, not what to think. There are rules of thinking, which are called logic. And everybody knows that in the realm of philosophy. And from, again, the earliest formulations of these rules with Aristotle down to the present day, we have, of course, debates on what these rules mean, on how do these rules prove this or that particular worldview or religion or philosophy. But nonetheless, everybody within that debate is bound by the rules. And if you don't accept those rules of thinking, then you're out. And so what Western classical education did was it created a framework of a set of assumptions and rules for what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be a good person, and what it meant to think. All of these have been swept away and destroyed. Part of it for economic reasons, and Aleksey and Keith and Florian have all talked about how that benefits corporations in various ways, has also been the result of active government action. Because, as I've mentioned before in other places, I've come to the opinion of Keith Preston that the culture war is essentially meaningless. It's not important. But then I've dug a little bit deeper and argued that it was a counter gang created to divide and conquer, or the culture war is counter gangs led by, the frozen conflict led by counter gangs. So frozen conflict in geopolitical terms means an ongoing conflict short of actual violence, but no ceasefire or peace treaty. No peace treaty. And counter gangs are basically organizations led by opponents of the actual viewpoint held, but they're led in such a way as to diffuse the energy. The term began in the Mau Mau Rebellion when Frank Kitson organized false black Kenyan nationalist movements in order to divest the Mau Mau of support. And so, of course, it benefits them for control. But we've talked about the distinction between China and America, right? Because China has a government that wants to create a strong national identity, whereas America does not. The cultural war has inherently been to deconstruct the American identity. And I would argue in part that's because the anti-war pro-labor movement was getting pretty close to challenging, in the 60s, pretty close to challenging military-industrial complex. And as Phil Oakes pointed out before he died, that what you need is a unified culture, not a divided culture, in order to win this conflict against the military-industrial conflict. So, yeah, the idea then is, what do? You have to realize that this entire atomization is actually being pushed, on the one hand, yes, by economic pressures to create fungible cogs to work and be obedient, but also to solidify political control so that people do not challenge the government. And we also see this two-tiered education system of like the elites and everybody else, with Bertrand Russell and his scientific outlook and impact of science on society, and H.G. Wells' The Open Conspiracy and the New World Order, what I call the technological dictatorship tetrarchy, where they talk about this. And so the goal is to have, something for everyone else where they don't think or do anything and just do what they're told. And then, at least initially, the elites were supposed to get a better education, but, looking at our current crop of elites, I'm not sure that's the case anymore. All right, so let's see if Florian can work here. Hey, Florian, can you hear us?
I think I can. I can hear you all the time. Can you hear me?
Yeah. So you completely cut out. You couldn't hear us. We couldn't hear you. So why don't you finish what you were going to say?
When did I cut out?
That's a good question. Do you remember Alec or Keith when he cut out?
Yeah. Wait. So I remember hearing the part clearly that he mentioned the McDonald's subleases.
Yeah.
They
I know what it was. Prussian education. You said it might work for some people. That's what I last heard.
Yeah. Wait, but then Florian mentioned Keith's idea of diversity of opinion in education. And then he mentioned that Prussian education may work for a lot of people because it teaches mental strength and it stems from physical strength. It comes from discipline. It gives you clarity of mind. And my question about that, so if you are working with Keith's idea, then Keith's idea is diversity of opinion, the way John Stuart Mill had it there. The more debate, the better. But if you have the Prussian model of education that sucks the air out of the entire room, that the Prussian education is the antithesis to the diversity of opinion. You either have that or you have what Keith is proposing. I think they're fundamentally irreconcilable.
That's why I had it for the that's why it's restricted that Prussian model to to physical education. And I don't even know. The people run around on the track, right? It's not really people sitting in front of the teacher either, but it's a way of teaching discipline. And it doesn't need to be physical education per se, but it needs to be some way to teach people discipline and maybe even physical education to get their mind clear. And then that's outside the classroom basically, right? That happens in physical education. And then you can have that diversity of opinion in the classroom or whatever class model, whatever schooling model you have. So I was saying that basically the Prussian model may be good of creating people that are sound in mind if you apply that to physical education, but nothing else more.
Well, to your point, though, I guess, Florian, to your point, and then also Alec, to your question, the other thing that we have to remember is that there was one subset of the Prussian culture that was educated to think for itself, and that was the military. And one of the things was in his Trevor N. Dupuy's Genius for War, a U.S. military corporal who wrote about the German military system. He has a quotation from the Crown Prince prior to World War I saying, "You men were chosen to be commanders in the Emperor's army because you would know when to not obey an order." Now, no other army at the time taught you that. In Russia, France, or the United States, if you disobeyed an order, very bad things would happen to you. So I think, to sort of thread the needle here for Florian's point of view, it might be the case that a rigid educational structure is a precondition for a more creative one, in the sense that the German system starts out very restrictive, but once you think of it this way, it's like playing an instrument, right? You have to have a very strict regimen practicing the violin before you can play all of the classical pieces that you want to play. So would you agree with that as a way to reconcile what you just said, Florian?
Yeah, that's a very good way. Yes.
What would you say to that, Alec?
Well, see, I would agree that generally speaking, that to create an independently minded thinker, you need to teach them discipline first, and the military is one way to do it. And especially the Prussian military, in the sense that it fostered independent thought in that narrow context. But then the question is, though, if you raise soldiers or citizens or children in such a highly regimented way, aren't you going to decondition them out of thinking for themselves? Aren't you going to pressure them to the point where they no longer want to think for themselves? They've been incentivized to just follow orders. And even if you tell them, well, now it's time for you to use all that discipline and mental strength to make your own autonomous decisions, they're going to be at a point where they can't do it anymore. And you see, in the US military, we have a similar problem. That if you want to be a successful general, and there are a few of those, you better be both disciplined and at the same time independently minded. Yet the US military seems to be lacking that. They have plenty of disciplined men, but the system that instills discipline at the same time quashes the desire for independent thought. It may not necessarily quash the capacity for independent thought, but it certainly seems to suppress the desire to be independent. You become an institutionalized person as a result of that.
I think it can, and the United States does, but I would question the fact that it's a necessity, because one could easily envision, you could even argue, two parallel education tracks, one that's highly creative and one that is highly disciplined. And then later on in the development of a man's life, like maybe before he goes to college, 18, he then is shown how these two tracks interface. And it's like, oh, what I learned over here, which seemed totally unrelated to what I learned over there, actually interfaces together at some future point. Or within a regimented system, you could create spaces where you could be creative. And it's like, look, at this stage in your life, it's not appropriate for you to be too creative and freewheeling outside of this narrow context. But once you finish this, formative year of education, you will then learn that what you learned in this small component actually can allow you to be more creative overall, but you just weren't ready for that responsibility yet. It's just, the idea is you can't play a violin concerto unless you've had a serious amount of restrictive discipline where you're taught to play the violin. I think that's just a challenge for education in general, because you have to balance discipline and restrictions while at the same time not killing the creative element, which ultimately education seeks to foster in the long run. And that is the balance. But we're nearing the hour mark, so I think I'd like to start moving to final thoughts. And this conversation, of course, this video is not meant to end the conversation, but to start it, so I could easily see more discussions on education, maybe different aspects or more focused aspects. So we'll begin with you, Alec. What would you like to leave us with today?
Well, I think that to initiate the reform of education, we need to be aware of fundamental personality differences between students, and also differences in aptitude. As Keith said, there are some things that you cannot teach to every student. It's a given that intellectual abilities differ. But beyond that, people who are of the same intellectual ability may have different specialized abilities that are largely congenital. For example, you may have two people with an IQ of 110, which is high average, but one of them happens to be a talented musician, and the other seems to be more refined at cultivating social skills. Some people are naturally more predisposed to this. it's important to consult the Big Five system, which is the most empirically informed personality system about how people differ. For example, there are 5 traits known as openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And it's often easy to see what psychological tendencies people have at a very young age. For example, if you find that one student is very open to ideas and has a high score in openness, creative training may be just what they need. See, at this point, as you said, Todd, they may not be ready for that responsibility, but they're not creative yet. To be creative, you first need to master something. And to master something, you need discipline. Even the most shining creative genius out there still needs discipline. But people who have the potential to be creative need to be disciplined in a manner that does not quash their desire for creativity. Now, one example that comes to mind is law school. A lot of people who score highly in openness tend to think that the law school and the world of legal work is a way for them to implement their ideas and visions, and then they realize that law is actually very bureaucratic discipline. That in fact, law is a better fit for somebody who is low in openness but high in conscientiousness, who's naturally organized and industrious and disciplined. So there has got to be a way to integrate people with high scores in openness into society. And we're not doing a good job with a bureaucratized system of law and social justice and all these Puritan woke politics. I think that's actually a fundamental challenge for society. How do we channel the energy of people with creative potential? How do we allow them to contribute value? At this point, we're just simply turning them away to the creative arts, where many end up with drug addiction issues, as many famous musicians do. Many become dysfunctional, and the vast majority simply find themselves in a position where their openness or their capacity for creative achievement seems to be working against them, and society is missing out on that. As far as the other traits are concerned, like, say, conscientiousness, we got that covered. The Prussian system of education and George Ritzer's mcdonaldization has done everything that we could have done to harness the potential of people who are high in conscientiousness. If you're naturally disciplined, organized, and industrious, but not very open to experience, you're going to do well in school, assuming your IQ is average or above. Extroversion, yeah, we got that covered. I mean, the U.S. is a very extroverted society, and if you're a naturally extroverted person, you don't even need much schooling to find your passion for sales or public speaking or communications or broadcasting. So that's nothing to worry about. Agreeableness is an interesting notion. I think that's where women tend to struggle the most. Women score higher in agreeableness than men, but in the professional world, agreeableness does not really convert to financial success. It's actually a disadvantage. It's better to be disagreeable. But the woke ideology has an agenda. The proponents of the woke ideology want to restructure a society in a way that benefits women, meaning that we're supposed to be more agreeable. Men's got to be more like women. Good luck with that. That's never going to work. So we have a real problem on our hands, not only making a system of education that empowers agreeable people to succeed, but also people who are high in openness, as I mentioned. So agreeableness and openness are personality traits that have a lot of potential that so far is not yet actualized. Now, the last one is the most challenging, neuroticism. People who are emotionally unstable are really falling through the cracks these days, especially in the light of the consequences of the global pandemic. We're seeing a rash of suicides, self-harming among young people, obesity, just outright insanity. And my impression is that the system of education just further exacerbates this mental health crisis. So there's got to be a way to refine the system of education that helps people who are not stable, who are not emotionally stable, who are neurotic, to actualize other talents. In a lot of cases, people who are neurotic can be quite agreeable and quite open to new experiences with a lot to offer. But if we have a system of education that tries to turn them into a 19th century style Prussian soldier, or a 19th century or an early 20th century American factory worker, some corporate shill, Well, they're going to be out of luck. So we have three categories to work in: neuroticism, agreeableness, and openness. Our system of education has left all these people behind.
Okay, Keith, what would you like to leave us with today?
Well, earlier I was talking more about the need for diversity of opinion or ideologies in educational institutions, but I also think we need diversity of organizational models and diversity of funding sources as well, because there are problems with that. Um, as far as organizational models, there are many, many different types of proposals for how education itself should be organized in an institutional structure and methodologies and that kind of thing. And I think some obviously would work and do work better than others. But one reason that I oppose compulsory education is that no business should have a coerced customer base. Whether it's a public enterprise like public schools or whether it's a private commercial business, uh, you know, there needs to be incentive for people who are running educational institutions to provide quality services. Not something where you're going to get your funding or you're going to have job security or whatever, no matter what you do. And I think that's a real problem with a lot of education. It's that you have a compulsory client base or compulsory customer base. You don't have to compete for clients or customers. So I would generally say that there should be as many organizational models as well for education. Like I'm often asked what I think about things like charter schools and school vouchers and all those kinds of things. And I'm generally in favor of that kind of stuff, with the exception that I wouldn't want it to just be an upper class tax shelter. I do where say affluent people send their kids to elite private schools and then write it off as a tax deduction. I think something like that was more equitable, where everybody benefits from it, all class levels and that kind of stuff. I would be in favor of. But as far as organizational models, I'm not against public schools per se, as long as people want to have them. But then you can also have private, for-profit commercial schools. You could have nonprofit schools. You can have church schools, military schools. Nonprofit but non-religious private schools. As well as things like homeschools and all these experimental school models. I'm for as much proliferation of that as possible. And as far as the funding, one problem I see is that local public school systems are funded with local property taxes, which I think is an archaic model of funding schools. What you end up with there is that in some school districts in the United States, you have state-of-the-art, affluent, public school systems that are like university campuses. And you have other neighborhoods or other jurisdictions where the public school system is like a trailer park or something. And I think that that needs to be changed, in terms of how the funding is done. I don't know what the ideal system would be, and I'm also for local control over schools as much as possible. So I'm not advocating for a national public school system that's funded 100% by the federal government. That'd be terrible. I tend to be more for something like local control over schools, but then perhaps the funding is distributed through states, or federal government is involved through the federal system, so that there's more equitable funding, even if the control of it is and on an institutional level is localized. Whether that's viable or not, I'm not sure, but it's one idea. But I do think funding is a problem when it comes to the public school system. And also, with higher education, the student loan system is basically modern indentured servitude that increasingly approaches debt slavery. So we need to have a better method of funding public education. Higher education as well. I'd probably incline to raise the standards for admission, but at the same time lower the cost to the student. Where it doesn't cost as much for a student to go to college or university, but they have to meet higher standards to be there. It's not going to be a $75,000 a year high school that you're going to. There needs to be lower cost and higher admission standards. Whether that's done, publicly, through whether that's government or corporate or philanthropy or something else, nonprofit or whatever. I don't know what the ideal model would be, maybe a combination of all of those, but there definitely needs to be a better method of funding higher education so that it's not just a debt slave factory.
Yeah. All right. Florian, you get the last word today.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect.
Yep.
Great. To both Keith and Alexei, I can add something. So for what Keith said for financing, I think what colleges do, I don't know whether that's possible on a school level, on a high school level, but what colleges do is nowadays, some of them, they will demand only payment from students after they found a job once they finish college. So it's mostly like college institutions for technical stuff like programming and that kind of stuff. But that's one model where everyone can go to college, and the college needs to also make sure that the students get a good get good enough that they can get into an actual job that pays money, right? That disincentivizes the theater studies majors and something like that. And then I think to sort of what Alexei said, uh, you can do it with the ocean, the five trade system, but you can also do it practically. So, for example, why not have a seventh and eighth grade of high school, have expose students to many different future professional careers, right? So basically, show them what it means to be a lawyer, show them what it means to be a salesperson, show them what it means to be a scientist, maybe even a bureaucrat, and all these different directions. And then they can try that all out. And then by the time that ninth and 10th grade come around, they can already specialize in the area they like most, right? That would be something that would work best, and maybe that would probably be in alignment with what the students would score in the ocean personality test as well. But that would be a way how you can make school a little bit more fruitful to fulfill its purpose of getting people into the careers they like, or into what they helping kids to discover what they really like to do.
All right. Thank you, Alec and Keith and Florian. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.